We are live.
Live Senate Appropriation, May 16th. We are going over H454, the Education Transformation Bill. We're going to do a quick walkthrough with Ledge Council of the sections just so we know what it is, but mostly want to go through this biggest fiscal note I've ever seen. 15 pages. So I was thinking that let's say James was going to go first, because that's my understanding is that James worked through that section. So she worked through the first part of the bill.
Yes, that's correct. Yep, I'm here, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I am at home under the weather, and I would appreciate keeping my camera off.
Sure.
How much time do you have? Like, how high level do you want to get on the policy section?
It's pretty high level,
Okay.
and I don't know if you're, and if you, my understanding you're also trying to do this for the Senate Education Committee that's listening in, so if you need to point out changes so that for their purposes, that's, why don't you focus on that, but also just for our purposes, just let us know what the section is, but
sure. And
very high level.
Sure, would you like me to share my screen?
Yeah, if you want to. What are you thinking? Oh, you can. Okay. That's fine.
My guy,
Yeah.
you got the color
I know.
copy. Can I have
Don't
black
take
and
it.
white
No,
one?
yeah.
Okay, so this is this is Senate Finance's proposal of amendment. The good news for Senate Education is they made no changes to any of the policy sections that I was responsible for drafting, with the exception of adding a new section that I'll highlight when we get there. But there were no changes made to any of the policy sections. It starts with some intent language, and I will just focus on what I think is the most important pieces for you all to understand, and that is...
You can skip the, we can just read that.
Okay, I do just want to note that there's some specific language in here about updates the legislature will make next year, and some of the changes that you'll see in the finance sections are contingent on the legislature making those changes, but I will move on. Section 2 amends the Commission on the Future of Public Education to take basically all of their work, strike all of their work, and take it down to just looking at and making recommendations to you all on state level governance. So what is the role of the Agency of Education? What's the role of the State Board of Education? What does a process for community involvement in school closures look like? And what's an analysis of the impact on healthcare costs in the Ed Fund? The Commission also would wrap up a little earlier as contemplated in this amendment. It would finish its work on September 30th, 2025, and then cease to exist on October 15th, 2025. Section 3 is the creation of the School District Boundary Task Force to determine the most efficient number of school districts and supervisory unions based on a certain list of concepts. And the task force is also required to make recommendations on an alternative process to encourage school district consolidation if the General Assembly fails to enact new school district boundaries not later than January 31st, 2026. This is an all legislative member task force, 4 members of the House, 4 members of the Senate. They're required to make proposals to you all on the boundaries of new school districts and supervisory unions. And those boundaries need to meet certain criteria that, for the sake of time, I'll skip through. And the alternative merger proposal also needs to meet certain criteria. Task force is required to obtain public input in their work. They will have the assistance of Ledge Council, JFO, Legislative Operations, and the Agency of Digital Services BCGI. They are also able to hire a consultant. Their deliverables to you all are on or before December 15th, 2025, a report kind of explaining their methodology and the reasons behind the decisions they arrived at, as well as a map with the new school district boundaries. They are entitled to per diem and compensation for not more than 16 meetings. And there's an appropriation in here of $100,000 to the Office of Ledge Counsel for the hiring of one or more consultants. This is the new section that Senate Finance added, transitional school boards. It starts with some definitions, but basically what it does, based very closely on the model that some of the mergers in Act 46 used, is that on or before January 1st, 2027, transitional school boards will be formed for each new school district that's created during the 2026 session by the General Assembly. And the school boards will be composed of the chair of each school board as the forming districts existed on December 31st, 2026. And the transition board is essentially getting the new school districts up and running. They've got to hire superintendent, develop the budget, all of the business processes that need to occur. So they have their own responsibilities, and they would be doing all of the responsibilities for the initial board until the initial board is impaneled. One of the major responsibilities that the transitional board would have is to essentially create wards within the school districts, so voting districts, for proportional representation on a new school board. And then once those wards are created, new school board members would be elected in March 2028. And then once they are seated, the transitional board would cease to exist, and the new school board, the elected school board, would spring to life, wrap up all of the other transition processes that haven't happened yet, and the new school districts would theoretically be ready to go on July 1, 2028. This section also includes transition facilitation grants, although there is no appropriation for this. The language contemplates that once transition school boards are formed, so remember that wouldn't be before you all enact new school districts next year, they would receive a transition facilitation grant, which would be 5% of the base amount multiplied by the greater of either the combined enrollment or the average daily membership of the forming districts on July 1, 2026, or $250,000, whichever is less. This is very similar to the transition grants that were created in Act 46. And then those grants would be essentially used for the transition process. State aid for school construction. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this next several sections. The state aid for school construction language creates a state aid for school construction program that would be run by AOE. Section 5 essentially creates the program within AOE and all of AOE's responsibilities. Section 6 creates the state aid for school construction advisory board to advise the Agency of Education on all of their school construction duties. And it's composed of the treasurer, commissioner of BGS, executive director of the bond bank, the chair of the State Board of Education, and 4 members, 2 who are appointed by the speaker with various expertise, and 2 who are appointed by the Senate with various expertise. This group is also charged with writing a report to you all, and this would be a standing committee. There's the next section is a prospective repeal or sunset in 10 years. So the advisory board would remain kind of as a standing committee. But they are charged with reporting back to you all by December of next year with some recommendations on how to handle debt obligations as school consolidation is contemplated. Section 8 creates the School Construction Aid Special Fund to be administered by AOE to award school aid, state aid to school construction projects, grants through the Facilities Master Grant Program, and funding of administrative costs, as well as emergency aid. The funds consist of any amounts transferred or appropriated to it by the General Assembly, any amounts deposited in the fund from the supplemental district spending reserve, and any interest earned by the fund. Section 9 details the analysis that the Agency of Education would undergo in order to award school construction aid. There's quite a bit of deference built into these sections for the agency to engage in rulemaking for some of the criteria that they would use to look at applications and determine which projects received priority and how much money they received. On page 38, I think the most important piece for you all would be the how much school districts would be eligible for, and that is 20% of eligible debt service costs of a project. The agency in rulemaking would determine what eligible costs are. Projects would be eligible for additional bonus incentives up to an additional 20% of the eligible debt service cost. And again, those bonus incentives would be worked out through rulemaking. They would be awarded annually. So it wouldn't be a lump sum of that 20%. It would be an annual award. And then there's an emergency aid provision for up to 30% of eligible project costs, up to a maximum eligible total project cost of $300,000, which I believe, I'm not the math person, but I believe that comes out to about $90,000. If anyone is aggrieved by a decision by the agency, they could appeal that to the Superior Court. Rulemaking is currently lives with the State Board of Education. It's transferred to the Agency of Education. And then Section 12 repeals current law related to the school construction program and the application process, as well as the appeal section, because you've replaced it with the language that I just walked through very briefly. Section 13, I'm on page 39, tuition to approved schools. Section 828 in Title 16 dictates which educational institutions a school district is allowed to pay tuition to. And so the amendments here are a public school located in Vermont, an approved independent school that is located in Vermont, is currently an approved independent school, is located either within an supervisory district that does not operate a public school for some or all grades as of July 1, 2024, or a supervisory union with one or more member districts that does not operate public school for some or all grades as of July 1, 2024, and had at least 25% of its Vermont resident student enrollment composed of publicly tuitioned students for the 23-24 school year. So that's for in-state school approved independent schools. Tutorial programs remain approved, approved education programs remain approved. And then for out-of-state schools, public school districts could pay tuition to a public school located within 25 miles of the Vermont border in a bordering state or province, or they could pay tuition to an independent school located within 25 miles of the Vermont border in a bordering state or province that is approved under the laws of that state or province, had at least one or more Vermont resident students enrolled in grades 9 through 12 on a district-funded tuition basis in the 23-24 school year, and complies with reporting requirements related to certain pieces of data school districts need in order to calculate their ADM and long-term weighted average. And then tuition could go to a therapeutic approved independent school regardless of where it was located, as long as it was approved under the laws of that state or country. And this section creates a term for therapeutic approved independent school. Section 14 is a bit of grandfathering language. So anyone who's enrolled is currently attending an approved independent school for this school year or is enrolled for next school year could continue at that school under public tuition until they graduate, even if this law takes effect and that school would no longer be eligible under the new law. Section 15 asks the state board to update their independent school rules to comply with the changes I just walked you through regarding which schools are eligible for public tuition, and to write a report back to you all on what it means for a school to be deemed small by necessity. Section 16 asks the State Board of Education to basically do a sunset review of all of its rules and update you all on whether any of those rules are no longer needed and what their plan is for updating rules that are out of date or need updating. And there is a $200,000 appropriation from the general fund to AOE to provide the State Board of Education with the contracted resources necessary to review and update the board's rules. Section 17 asks the Agency of Education to make a substantial number of report backs to you all. The first one is regarding statewide graduation requirements. The second is implementation of a statewide financial data and student information system. I'm on page 44. The third is recommendations for a school construction division. What does that look like within the AOE, staffing, et cetera? The fourth report back under this section is a progress report on the type of guidance AOE will provide to the field during consolidation and transition to larger school districts. The fifth report back under this section is an analysis of how education payments are allocated within school districts and what, if any, changes are necessary to ensure students who receive weights are actually benefiting from the additional funding associated with the applicable weights. And then the sixth report under this section is asking AOE to work with the Office of Workforce Strategy and Development to report back to you all with recommendations on how to increase flexible pathways opportunities. Section 18 asks for a report back from AOE on essentially the state of special education delivery, an update on the implementation of special education changes made pursuant to Act 173, and what, if any, changes are needed to meet certain goals regarding the delivery of special education in Vermont. Section 19 requires the agency to develop a strategic plan for the delivery of special education, a 3-year strategic plan, and also to come up with some contingency recommendations should federal special education funding either no longer be available or should it transition to a system that requires more planning and management on the part of the state to ensure funds are distributed equitably. And then there are report backs to you all on all of that work. Section 20 creates a position within the Agency of Education to support the development of the strategic plan, special education strategic plan, and that is a $150,000 appropriation for that position. And then section 21 changes the tuition section to go along with the new foundation formula that John is about to walk you through. This is my last section. So currently you can see there the district shall pay the full tuition charge at students attending a public school. And then you can see the struck language down here regarding independent schools is the average announced tuition. What this section does is it says tuition for every student K through 12 would be an amount equal to the base amount multiplied by the sum of 1 in any weights applicable to the resident student for each student attending the school. So the money is going to follow the student for tuitioning. The base and any weights applicable for each student would go to the receiving school, whether it's a public school or an independent school. And that means that money is going to vary student by student depending on the weights applicable to each student, but the base amount would remain the same. And I believe there's some repeals to go along, some conforming changes here, repealing the rest of the tuition sections that no longer are necessary due to that change. And those are all of the sections that I am responsible for.
Thank you, Ms. St. James. How do you want to proceed? You have other things that you need to tell the Senate Education, or do you need to be the one that goes through the amendment? My understanding is you drafted, or could the other attorneys do that? Because we could let you go.
Oh, that's very, very kind of you. I'm happy to stick around and go through that amendment. I've gone through all of the policy changes, and John's about to walk through the changes to finance. So I'm okay hanging on until you get to the amendment.
Okay. And I did have a lot of just like little questions that I didn't want to have the whole committee suffer through my questions, so I might try to contact you separately, or but somebody else might be able to answer them. So if not, I won't. But I'm giving you a warning that I might try to contact.
Appreciate it, and I am available.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel, got our screen share. I know you guys are trying to cover a lot, so I'm happy to go just tell you what the sections are, and then if they're different from something you've received, but please feel free to jump in. So we're talking about the education finance system now. Section 23, we're amending the Title 16 chapter that governs state funding of public education. What you're seeing are definitional changes to move to a foundation formula. So this includes your base amount, $14,541 per student. That will be multiplied by a set of weights to determine the educational opportunity payment, which is the aggregate figure that a school district receives.
And I do have a question on this page, and that is under right above the where it talks about the base amount, and above
Yes.
there's a change from base education to categorical base amount.
Yep.
What is that 6,800?
That is an existing figure that's been in here for many, many years to calculate things like adult education and other categorical pieces. It's not used for every categorical piece, but the reason that the definition has changed here is so that you don't confuse base amount with base education amount. So entirely for avoiding confusion purposes, but this is part of existing law.
Just we need that number to use for others.
Exactly, and if you make additional changes in the upcoming years to how you do categorical A, potentially you could eliminate this, but it depends on future choices.
Okay, thank you.
And there is an inflator built in, as you can see, for the base amount, so this would adjust across the years. Section 24, this is your weighting section, how you determine your weighted student count, which again is what's multiplied by that base amount to give you your aggregate figure for the school district, reflecting the cost of students there. This is the same weighting section as Senate Education proposed. So it includes economic disadvantage, it includes distinguished categories for English language learners. It includes, I'm going to jump down to the actual weights themselves. Let's see.
I have a question. So I'm going to ask you more questions.
Oh, okay.
Here,
I don't have to go as fast as I'm going.
no, you can go that fast. On the levels of EL proficiency,
yes.
How are those determined?
What you're pulling in here is a recognized, and you can see it on the screen, a standardized measure of academic language proficiency. So these are standards that folks out in the field already have. This isn't creating some new system. It's hinging on existing measures for English language proficiency and just saying, if you are categorized in this way, in this already existing program, you are warranting this particular weight.
Okay.
And obviously the weights increase, or they
just
decrease as you increase in proficiency levels.
I didn't see that definition before. Okay.
Yep. Okay, so it will be easier for me to just jump to page 59 where the actual weights are, just to orient for this section. The section is based on definitions, then you count up students within particular categories, but you then talk about the categories again when you ask what weight should be applied to them. So you're going to get the same picture just looking at the weighting section as against the counting section. So grade level weights are applied in this model. Again, this is consistent with what came across from Senate Education. You get, we have some secondary weights, so 0.02 if 6 through 8 grades, and then 0.10 if you're in one of grades 9 through 12. You have an economic disadvantage weight of 1.02. We come to our EL proficiency weights. This is, you're getting, basically it's an inverse relationship between the weight and the proficiency level. So the lower your proficiency level, the higher weight you receive. You can see at level 1, you get 2.11. This is on top of, right? These are additive weights. So you have your 1 plus these weights.
And John, the prior weights, since those were tax capacity weights,
yes,
they're just, it's total apples and oranges. We can't.
There's no comparison.
There's no comparison.
There's no comparison. Although people want to.
Because sometimes they're close and sometimes they're not close at all.
Exactly, like in the economic disadvantage, you see that 1.03 to 1.02. It suggests a slight tweak, but it's literally a different education finance system.
So like pre-kindergarten is a big
negative, yeah. You can see at the highest English language proficiency level that weight drops down to 0.12, so it's a much smaller weight in relationship to your lowest English language proficiency level. We also provide for EL students this newcomer SLIFE weight. SLIFE means student with limited or interrupted formal education. So this is an additional weight you could be an EL, you could be an English language learner falling into one of those proficiency levels, and you would get, that 2.11 if you're in level 1. If you also happen to be newcomer select, you would receive an additional 0.42. You don't see a period there because you're getting a period here, otherwise it looks funny.
And SLIFE is something that's used.
Yep.
That's like a weight used in other states.
I don't know what other states use something along this line. The EL newcomer SLIFE, the first context in which I saw it was from Dr. Colby's memo on the House side, so it's distinguishing among English language learners, and then was built in as well to, or was consistent with some of the models that were presented in student education. But you guys already have English language learner weights. Obviously, they're different kinds of weights, but this is breaking those out. So you have more distinguishing within that category. So you don't just have a flat figure, right? You have a small school weight, and the important thing to note about this is it is conditional on a sparsity judgment. So not all small schools get a weight. It's if the number of persons per square mile within the land area, the geographic boundaries of that school district, is fewer than 55, then for each pupil who attends a small school, they receive an additional weighting amount of 0.21. And you can see that this is the same weight as the tax capacity weight, so no update there to what the weight is. But again, we're in a different system. You're just seeing the same figure. Again, that's the small school weight is conditional on a sparsity criterion, but you're going to see that we don't have separately a sparsity weight.
And the early on part that James went over, they needed to come up with, I think this is guidance on sparsity or small by necessity. And I didn't know that term was used when you're creating the base.
That's actually an interesting point. In the House, you may still want to have that determination. In the House version, there was a small schools support grant proposed, and the condition would be a particular pupil level, so say fewer than 100, and the other condition was that they would have been designated under those state board rules to be small by necessity, and that would be an alternative way of building sparsity into your judgment as to what is an appropriate small school to which to route funding, right? So there was a linkage before between small by necessity and that weight that was developed. You may still need that determination, but because you don't have a specific sparsity weight here, we don't pick up that term small by necessity. But that's
So they left that in, but finance took out the small by necessity
weight. But it's not to say that that term may not have other usages.
Okay.
It may still be useful.
And I assume when it said guidance, they meant like a definition.
Yeah, like exactly. Like what counts? What do you think small by necessity is? Unchanging here, the way you determine your weighted long-term membership is adding up those weight counts, right? What you see below is consistent with the definition of educational opportunity payment. Your educational opportunity payment is the aggregate figure a school district receives to cover the cost of educating its children, and it's determined by multiplying that weighted long-term membership that you've just determined under this section by counting up all those weights and multiplying it by the base amount. That roughly 14.5 figure that you saw. So you multiply that to get it's basically a weighted student amount, right? And it's for all students within the school district. On page 62, you see repeal of language about updating weights. The reason that this is removed is it assumes a duplicable methodology to produce the weights based on the way that the weights were chosen. Don't think you could duplicate that, so it's repealed. Section 25, this is different than what was received from Senate Education. So we have the set of weights that were just proposed that we walked through, and what you're seeing here is the addition. It's a contingent addition of a weight for CTE pupils. So that's what you see on 63. CTE pupils, those are eligible for career technical education. You would count up for each school district the number of CTE pupils using full-time equivalent counts. And then those pupils would receive an additional weighting amount of 1.00. So this is built out separately from the full weighting section because unlike the other section, it has a contingent implementation. And the way that this works is the contingency is it would roll out on the same date, July 1, 2027, which is when the rollout of the foundation formula is proposed, provided that the governance and policy assumptions that support this particular weight are in place, basically. So only put this weight in, only have it come online if you've done the changes in policy to justify that weight. And those changes in policy do not occur in this bill. So. Section 26, for some of these I may just say conforming changes and move on if that's cool. This is our education payment section. So this is making conforming changes to ensure that what you're paying out is not the current education finance payouts, instead that you pay out your EOP and your supplemental district spending, which is what we'll come to shortly when we get to Title 32. And I'm sorry that I'm going so fast. Please do feel free to.
I do have a question on this. I think I figured it out.
The transition?
Yeah, the transition payments. I think I was just getting confused because you're adding a negative,
exactly.
You're multiplying a negative and a positive, so it's a negative number.
That's exactly right.
So you're just either subtracting money from them or you're giving them money.
Exactly, and this one I'm happy to go a little bit slower on. This is a proposed, you see 4 years, but the 5th year is when you would be fully transitioned to something. So it's a proposed 5-year transition related to the educational opportunity payment, that aggregate figure that a school district receives. And the way that it's determined is if your, and I'll come to the definition section, but just to state what it does, if your education spending in FY25 is below the educational opportunity payment you would receive as calculated using the foundation formula across those 5 years, it asks, what is the gap between your FY25 spend and the EOP? And then each year it gives you 1/5 of that gap. And if you're below, if your FY25 is below your EOP, then it moves you upwards. And if your FY25 is above, it moves you downward. I love how clean this is because it's adding both positive and negatives, but it's you get your EOP plus a yearly adjustment, and it is important to note you're adding a negative if your FY25 is above. So that's what brings you down, and these numbers are what generate your 5th. It's giving you a 5th of that transitional gap. And you can see below on 67, the transition gap, that's the amount, whether positive or negative, that results from subtracting your EOP from the ed spend in FY25, and that's what produces the incremental up and incremental down. Does that make sense?
Because they didn't want school districts either to have $6 million more that they didn't have the year before, because that'd be hard to spend in 1 year. And
yep, and on the other side, exactly, on the other side, the concern was if you've been spending at a particular rate, you need to be eased, or the suggestion is that you would be eased into a lower amount.
Okay.
Section 27, more conforming changes. This is ensuring that your ed fund picks up the supplemental district spending tax that will come to in Title 32. And the struck language you see here is later on we're going to come to the repeal of the property tax credit, which is proposed to be replaced with a homestead exemption. This language here, we currently make payments for the property tax credit out of the ed fund, so we don't need to have that language once you repeal it. Section 28, this is truly cleanup language, historic language referencing an old act. Section 29, more conforming changes, aligning the same payment schedule as we currently do for our education finance system to the new EOP and supplemental district spending. We've removed some technical measures you no longer need. We don't have an excess spending or high spending concept in this draft. You just have a cap on what can be raised. So there's no penalty that you pay. You just are capped at what you can actually raise. Section 30, I'm not going to say too much about that, but just to know, this is your section that describes the budget vote that would go out to school districts. And the thing to take note of is that because you're prescribing a foundation formula amount, schools are not voting on the educational opportunity payment they receive, right? That's just a mathematical calculation. You determine that. What they are voting on is if they want to do extra spending, which we call supplemental district spending. So the form of the vote that you see here is describing what would be done for the supplemental district spending. There's sets of information that would be provided that, including what the anticipated homestead tax rate and non-homestead tax rate would be. I may slow down a little bit to go through this, but it's going to make more sense once we get to Title 32. Basically what this says is include alongside the vote the mathematical definitions that explain how we can tell you what rate you have to pay for the vote that you're about to make. And so what you'll see below is the form of the vote is, shall the voters approve a particular amount, which is the amount the school board has determined to be necessary in excess of that EOP put into the fiscal year. So it's making clear what you're voting on is extra, it's not the EOP. And then probably more important to the voter, the district estimates that this proposed budget, if approved, would result in per pupil supplemental district spending of a particular figure. We tell them where that stands relative to spending for the current year, and then what they're especially going to be interested in, and a supplemental district spending tax rate of whatever is required to raise that particular value. So in their budget vote, they are being told maybe not with complete certainty, but close, depending on the information they have at that point, close to what it will be required to raise the amount that they're voting on. And that will make more sense once I get to the Title 52 sections. But your vote will say, you're voting on something extra, here's how different it is from current year, and this is the rate it will take on top of the uniform homestead, non-homestead, to raise this person.
So if they're a high grant list town, would it include the total amount that they're raising, or just the amount?
That's just the amount that they're voting on. It doesn't say, right, when we come to the equalization mechanism, we're going to see that districts will raise different amounts at the same rate. This doesn't tell them what they raise, it tells them what they're approving, so what they will receive. Yep, exactly.
They probably would, some of them wouldn't vote for it, maybe if they told them what they were raising and then they saw how much they were keeping. Maybe.
Might other people. Yeah. Although, of course, the theoretical justification is the same tax burden, right? It's similar to the kind of equity concerns we try to integrate in our current tax capacity situation. Section 31, set of repeals. This is repealing concepts only necessary for the current system, so that's why those are dropping away. They're predicated on, for instance, definitions that would no longer exist in the new definition. Section 32 is standing up a supplemental district spending reserve, which is the reserve where recaptured money, so from that equalization measure, which is for your supplemental district spending, would go. So if you, in applying the equalization, the equalized rate for school districts, if your school district raises more funds than they would receive back, they would go to this reserve, and in the first instance, in subsection B, those amounts would be used to cover payments in that year if there was a mathematical error, basically. So if something was slightly off, you could use those payments to offset that error. And then under subsection C, what you see is if funds remain after that piece, those would be transferred into the school construction aid special fund, so to help cover costs of school construction across the state. And it is important to note that's available statewide, right? So the funds are being recaptured as people vote on spending above their educational opportunity payment, and then the funds that are raised extra through the equalization measures go to this reserve and are made available statewide for that school construction aid special fund. Sections 33 and 34 are sets of reports. So AOEs to report back on transportation reimbursement, and JFOs to report back both on pre-K and what kinds of inflators would be best suited to Vermont's education funding system. We have built in throughout the inflator NEPA or NIPA, I'm not sure how to say this still. So we'll learn more. Section 35 this was a request from the Department of Tax. We have in law of this Education Fund Advisory Committee, and the first meeting was to occur this summer. Given the amount of change that is happening in the system, they asked for a delay so they wouldn't be essentially doing the same work that's happening in the State House. Okay, Section 36, your education property tax rate formula. We're going to get into that extra spending. This is your supplemental district spending. So I'm going to go a little bit slower here, if that's okay. I say that as I quickly flip through the pages. We're striking through existing concepts, right? And I'll slow down on the actual concepts. I'm going to come back to recapture because it's going to make more sense in a second. And first, I'm going to talk on page 79 about the definition of supplemental district spending. This is that voted amount. When a school district votes in excess of the COP, there is a cap. So you will see on line 6, provided that the voters of a school district, other than an interstate school district, and I'll come back to that, shall not approve spending in excess of 10% of the product of the base amount and the school district's long-term membership. So this basically says you can't spend more than 10% of an unweighted base amount for all the students in the district in supplemental district spending. So it applies a cap to what they can raise with the supplemental district spending tax, and that cap is tied to not a weighted pupil count, it is tied to the outright pupil count, non-weighted. I will also come back to the yield in just a second. Per pupil, supplemental district spending into
it doesn't include any other payments that they get other than the opportunity payment. So if they get after transportation, they don't get 10% of that. That's correct. The cap is tied exclusively to that calculation of base time to long-term membership. It doesn't affect any things outside the scope of the base amount. Yep. But if everything was built into the base, if everything theoretically had built into the base, then you would talk to that. But I don't think that that's the current state of affairs. Right. The transportation.
Yep. Your per pupil supplemental district spending intuitive. That's you take your supplemental district spending, which I'm just going to say SDS now, so I don't keep mispronouncing this, SDS, and you divide it by long-term membership. Again, you're dividing by a non-weighted count. So you're getting a per pupil figure reflective of the voted amount against your pupil count. And I promise that I will go up, but first I want to hit this last piece. We're now getting into, so we talked about the voted amount, we talked about the cap, we talked about a per pupil amount. Let's talk about how we equalize, because the part of the problem that you're trying to face here is how do you ensure that school districts that are raising this on their local grand list, this would not be raised statewide like the other tax to raise your EOP is. This is not raised statewide, this is raised on local grand lists. And so how do you ensure that folks can raise the same amounts at the same tax? So the way that this is done, the equalization mechanism that's included here is school district with the lowest, you have to identify the school district with the lowest taxing capacity. This is your school district that's anticipated to have the lowest aggregate equalized education property tax grand list for long-term membership. And so the way to think about this is who can put forward the least in property value per student. Once you have identified this school district, you would then go up to the supplemental district spending yield. You would ask how much property tax revenue per long-term membership could be raised in that lowest taxing capacity district at a rate of $1 per $100 of equalized education property tax. So at 1%, what amount of revenue would be produced in that lowest property value per pupil school district? We can then divide your per pupil supplemental district spending by that figure. And basically what this is saying is pretend that you're the school district with the lowest taxing capacity district. You do that by dividing your per pupil supplemental district spending by that yield. And it tells you the rate that you would have to use were you that lowest taxing capacity district to raise the funds that you have voted. That's what it does. Of course, when you apply this against a different grand list than that lowest taxing capacity district, the result is that you raise extra funds. So everyone's applying the same rates to receive the same amounts, but the result is that you raise extra funds, and that's why I scroll back up to recapture on the bottom of page 78. That's the amount of revenue that's raised through imposition of that supplemental district spending tax that is in excess of its supplemental district spending. So how much extra did you raise beyond what you voted? And that is what is recaptured and placed into that reserve that we just talked about. I'm happy to keep going, but I will just pause.
What happens to the reserve? Did we already cover that, or does that have to come?
Yep, we covered it, but it will make more sense now. So the reserves amount are first used to account for mathematical errors related to the SDS. So if someone had a slightly off count or something like that, let's address that through extra funds raised. And then secondarily, after you've accounted for the mathematical errors, assuming that there are any, it would flow to the school construction aid special fund where it would be available for school construction projects across the state. And just note that the school district configuration is going to have a dramatic effect on what this equalization mechanism means, right? If you have a setup where the school districts are relatively comparable in grand list value that they can put forward per pupil, your equalization is going to be relatively minor, right? But if you have something like the current state of affairs of school district configuration, then you could have wildly different grand list values available per pupil. And so the equalization mechanism, if it were implemented into the current system, would have some school districts raising dramatically more at the same tax rate, right? So school district configuration matters in every way throughout this bill, but this is one of the ways that's especially important is for the equalization mechanism.
And isn't it an important difference between the House version and the Senate version is that the House version waits till the districts are known before they apply this?
It is true that the rollout of the foundation formula in the House version is contingent on the new school district boundaries, the new school districts being operational, meaning that you would know at the time of the foundation formula rollout, the time that you also roll out the supplemental district spending tax, what your school district configuration is. In this bill, this rollout is happening agnostic as to what happens with the school district boundaries. So you guys can make changes to the school district boundaries, or you cannot. And either way, this would be rolled out.
But if this bill passed as coming out of finance and you wanted to change it, you would be kind of too late for that first year. This would happen.
The timing point you identify is that if you have a FY28 rollout, people have to start building their budgets quite quickly, right? And to build your budget, you need to know what your school district is, presumably. So, yes. Yep. Section.
Could I ask, going back to the supplemental district spending, should they opt to spend 10% more?
Mhm.
They can do anything up to 10%. And how does the money revert back if it wasn't needed? How does that happen?
Yep. So what happens is all money, whether raised through the statewide rate, which is for the EOP and other expenditures from the ed fund, plus the supplemental district spending tax, all revenue raised from both of those education taxes, one is statewide, one is local, all go to the ed fund. And then the money comes back, much as it does in the current system, right? You get your payouts on a regular schedule. And so you would receive back the voted amount in increments throughout the, using increment because I'm in the chip world, but you would receive amounts throughout, yes, exactly. You would receive throughout the year your payment. And then the other pieces would remain in that reserve within the ed fund. And it is important to note, I don't think I said that before, that supplemental district spending reserve is a reserve within the ed fund. So it stays there and then is used for the mathematical errors. And then at the end of the fiscal year, once you've accounted for everything, is moved over to that school construction aid special fund. But the school district just gets back its voted amount. The extra amounts stay in that reserve and then flow.
I just have a question about the schools that are getting more money than they are by 25 cents.
Yes.
They're not required to spend it, but they're required to accept it. You know what I mean? Could they accept it and just like put it in a reserve and just spend the interest for years?
As far as I know, there are no outright prescriptions as to uses of funds. You're getting a foundation formula amount that is calculated, with the idea that you're providing funding for particular students, accounting for the differences in educational needs. But there's nothing to say that you have to spend them in a particular way, right?
And there's no advantage to them or their taxpayers to not. You can't like give it back, or there's no way you can.
There's no way to advantage exactly. You're going to be paying a uniform rate that is every school district has to pay to raise the EOP.
But you could, if you did it for enough years, had enough delta there, you could build up like a little endowment that you wouldn't have to do the supplemental
district spending,
because you could just use the interest off this little endowment you created.
So I had not thought about that, but I think the answer is theoretically yes.
But if you were receiving 100% and you were putting it in reserve, chances are you weren't doing supplemental district spending.
For sure. Presumably you're not.
But if you wanted to in the future, you'd say, well, we don't have to go to the voters because we have this little $100,000 in interest. Or you could just use that money, even if it's not the interest, you can use the principal 5 years down the road for the new track field that you got to do instead of going to the voters.
I mean, it also points to part of what is so important about the school district boundaries and school board conversation, right? Because these are the folks that are going to be making that determination. So they could potentially be in a quite powerful position depending on the size of these school districts, right? So I think more work to come is the real response to this.
In this bill, though, is there any? I don't think there is, but I'm going to ask you option for a town to say, we're good with what we have. 90%. Send us 90%, not 100. We'll be good. Keep your tax rate down.
It wouldn't reduce your tax rate. That's the thing, is that your tax rate is unlike the current system where we account for variation right through the homestead tax rate across districts because people are voting different amounts. Here, the foundation formula amount produces an EOP for each school district. That's what you're getting, and that's what everyone is raising through that statewide tax rate. The extent to which folks can affect their local rates is entirely within the supplemental district spending. They can choose to not do that, but everyone's going to be paying that those uniform tax rates to raise the EOPs across the state. And even if they used less, they would still pay the tax rate.
Senator Weston?
I would just say, I know we don't have districts, and it's going to be a fight whether we get to that or not. My comment would be, I have a community that spends 13% below the state average. They have test scores well above the state average, and they twice have voted down budgets in the last 2 years when the school board has put a budget in front of them saying our test scores above the state average and we don't want our taxes to go up. I would think conversely, if we were going to let them go 10% above we ought to consider and then be able to go 10%.
I leave that to you guys.
That's a comment.
Yeah.
Good
That was
question.
a comment. I
Yeah,
said to you, is
I
this
know.
time for comment?
Can I make a comment? No, I can't. All right. Okay.
Yeah, you get paid more than us. You can't make a comment.
Can I say that I would like to get paid a lot more? That's my comment.
After this.
I think that was a good comment.
So, section 37, this is where we impose the actual statewide education tax. So, in the House bill that you had received, this presupposed or assumed that there would be these distinguishing property tax classifications, and so you had a set of categories here. Those property tax classifications have been pulled out, and so what you have is a statewide education tax imposed on a homestead and non-homestead at a uniform tax rate for non-homestead and a uniform tax rate for homestead, sufficient to cover those expenditures from the ed fund other than that SDS, the supplemental district spending, because that's being covered entirely by that supplemental district spending tax. The thing I would note here is this doesn't specify a relationship between the homestead and non-homestead rates. It doesn't say what the relative liability between those will be, right? But this is agnostic as to that choice, something that you could think about in the future. And in the House version, when they had the broken out property tax applications, the way that that worked is it included factors, and it would basically set up a mathematical relationship between them. So if you fall within this bucket, maybe your tax rate is twice as high for this particular class of property. But this is agnostic as to the relationship between homestead and non-homestead. And like the current system, the non-homestead rate and the homestead property tax rate, although here it's a rate rather than a yield, would be adopted each fiscal year. And that would be done to ensure that you're covering the expenditures from the ed fund. I'm going to jump quickly through these sections because this is just making all the conforming changes to make everything we just talked about happen. But please interrupt if you see things that you're wondering what is going on. Let me see where I should go next. Oh, yes. Okay. On the bottom of page 84, so we talked above about the statewide tax, uniform homestead, uniform non-homestead to raise sufficient revenue for expenditure from the ed fund, other than the SDS. So here is the imposition of the supplemental district spending tax. It is imposed locally, so it's on all homestead and non-homestead, and each member of municipality of the school district that approves spending pursuant to that budget that we walked through. This describes the calculation I was talking about in the Title 32 definition. So the commissioner determines that tax rate for each school district by dividing their per pupil supplemental district spending by that supplemental district spending yield. It's again asking them, pretend that you're the school district with the lowest taxing capacity district with the lowest taxing capacity. What rate would you need to apply to raise the amount that you voted? And that's determined by using this calculation. It's then billed out and assessed in the exact same way that we currently do those statewide pieces, but it's done locally. So you have a statewide rate, you have local.
I'm not clear on. I know we defined lowest tax capacity town previously, but I think I need it one more time.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what you do to identify the school district with the lowest taxing capacity is you ask what the aggregate equalized education property tax grand list of all the municipal members of a school district would be. So what is their equalized education property tax grand list? What property value do you have available across the municipality per long-term membership? So it's a per pupil figure. So it's asking how much property can this school district, how much property value is available in this school district per pupil? That's basically what I think about it.
Okay. Has there been any, do we know who that is right now? I mean,
I don't know. I don't know, but I'm sure someone knows.
Okay, so, because just to talk through it for a second, so we're really talking about towns, or I should say supervisory unions, perhaps, that have not a lot of, grand list value, and maybe have a lot of kids.
Right. So the building, it is a per pupil count, meaning that if you're, if you have a lot of kids, it would affect that term.
Right. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just to talk through that.
My guess is one that's just not a lot of kids, but just low spending, or low grand list.
A low grand list.
Or very low grand list.
Right.
Okay. Could be.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Sure. Section 38 is updates to your December 1 letter. And just note that, with this proposed foundation formula rollout July 1, 2027 for FY 28, the updates to the December 1 letter would happen July 1, 26, because you need that December 1 letter at the end of next year on the timeline proposed in this bill, so that folks know what they're doing in their budget building for the imminent rollout of the foundation formula. So what this letter would now contain is you wouldn't get your yields and your non-homestead rate. Instead, you would get a recommendation of a non-homestead rate, a homestead rate, and the supplemental district spending yield for the following fiscal year. We would make a couple of assumptions as they normally make. I'm going to jump down to the information that is provided in the December 1 letter in addition to those recommendations. So along with the recommendations, the commissioner would include the base amount and note that that is inflated, right? So it's not going to necessarily be the same figure each year. For each school district, you get the estimated long-term membership, the weighted long-term membership, and the aggregate equalized education property tax grand list. From that, you can then, in sub 3, have your estimated education property tax grand list per long-term membership. This is what tells you what your taxing capacity is. And then using that figure, you can identify what is the school district with the lowest taxing capacity. That is truly a mathematical calculation. You just look at those figures above, you can identify who it is. And once you know who that school district with the lowest taxing capacity is, you just ask, what could they raise at a 1% rate? What could they raise at $1 per $100 of equalized education property tax value? That figure is your supplemental district spending yield, and that is what you see above. That's one of the recommended features, right? They recommend non-homestead rate, homestead rate, and that supplemental district spending yield. That yield is provided in the budget that goes out to voters, and they can just divide their per pupil supplemental district spending as proposed in the budget by that yield, and voila, they have a rate that raises that amount. So that's how that works.
One other question.
Yeah.
So in the past, in terms of things that I've heard people complain about with the current system, is that the December 1st letter comes so late in the process, and they're trying to make these timelines. My assumption is that because we are effectively no longer voting in a budget in this construct, that the timeline, the school districts still need to figure out how they're going to spend their money, but it is not a matter of voting. And so it is that the timeline concerns may go away.
I think some of the timeline, the December 1 letter would still come at the same time, but I think the difference you would have from a timing perspective is that what you receive in the letter currently is yields, right, for the homestead piece, which is the variation that folks are asking about. And people don't know from those yields something meaningful about what they're going to do. Whereas here, you're outright receiving the rates that are proposed to be sufficient to cover your EOP, and then they provide that yield, and you can just divide what you want to spend per pupil in extra spending, that supplemental district spending, by the yield. So they would know earlier, with maybe not 100% certainty, because perhaps not all the figures have come in yet, but they would know earlier what kinds of rates they're looking at, and they might not have the same questions upon the budget going out related to like the CLA and other pieces, for instance, because they're just outright being told what the rates are. So it's simpler in ways. Section 39, tax rate transition. So we talked before about a payment transition, that if your FY25 spending stood in relation to your EOP, either above or below, you would be moved over time toward that EOP. We have a kind of similar concept for a tax rate transition. So folks' tax rates are going to be jumping as well, because you're going to have the imposition of a uniform homestead and uniform non-homestead. So how do you account for that? It's going to look quite similar, because you're going to see these transition gap multiplied by, et cetera. But basically what you're doing, I'm going to jump to the definition of transition gap. It is, you're identifying the gap, whether positive or negative, that results from subtracting your FY28 uniform homestead property tax rate. What would the tax rate be with the rollout of the foundation formula sufficient to raise the EOP if you didn't have this transition mechanism? What would that be? Everyone would have to pay that rate, and it would raise revenues to cover all EOP. What would that rate be? So you take that figure and you subtract it from the homestead property tax rate for that school district in fiscal year 27. So the year immediately preceding the foundation formula rollout, and you take the gap between those two rates. And what you get is, it's a fixed figure. This is not something that's reassessed each year of the transition. It's a historical figure, gap between 27 and 28. And then you divide that across a 5-year transition, and what it results in is cents. It tells you cents your rate. And so you can, in each year, calculate the homestead property tax rate that is sufficient to raise whatever all the expenditures are, accounting, for instance, for that EOP transition. And you get a discount or a penalty based on that transition gap, basically. So it's a way of smoothing the transition from the tax rate you're in 27 to 28. But just note that it may not look as smooth as you would imagine, because it's not something that's recalculated each year. It's literally, we have to determine a homestead property tax rate sufficient to cover expenditures. That has to be done based on expenditures, not on what people want to have their tax rates be, right? So it's based on expenditures, and then you're getting a discount if you're below, right, because you're being moved incrementally up to that. And if you're above, if you're above, you're receiving a discount getting down, and if you're below, you're being slowly moved up to that tax rate. You can have both transitions at once. I realize it sounds unintuitive, but it's yeah.
Okay.
I can pause it.
Okay.
Smoothness, both in transition to EOP and transition in tax rates. That's the idea. Section 40 is just conforming revisions. Okay. Section 41. I'm going to try to go through these quickly. There's going to be one section in particular that is probably the most of interest. So a lot of this is conforming changes, but this is repealing the property tax credit that we currently use, the income sensitivity measures that we talk about, and replacing it with a homestead exemption based on income and house site value. So I'm just going to jump down all the way to page 95. This is kind of the heart of it. Section 66, page 95. You're going to see a bunch of struck-through language that's removing the statewide PTC. It's important to note that the municipal property tax credit and municipal circuit breaker are retained. This is just replacing that statewide property tax credit with a proposed homestead exemption.
And this is new from the Senate.
This is new from the Senate. The concept of replacing the PTC with a homestead exemption was included in the House bill, but this specific configuration, the income brackets that are used, the house site cap that is used, that is new from Senate Finance. And so what you see is an eligible claimant whose household income doesn't exceed 100K would be entitled to a homestead property tax exemption in amount determined as follows. And basically you look at these tables. If you fall into this income bracket, you're entitled to this exemption. And I'll call out what the exemption is. So it is a homestead property tax exemption. So we're just talking about your homestead tax. We're not talking about non-homestead, against a particular figure of house site value. And house site is a technical term. It's not homestead, which could be larger. Your house site is your dwelling, so like homestead, but it's the surrounding 2 acres. So it is limited in size. And what you're getting is a homestead property tax exemption against the first, in this case, $425,000 in house site value. So what it means is if you fall into an income bracket, you're entitled to a percentage exemption of the first $425,000 of that house site value. You don't get an exemption in any house site value above that, right? And this doesn't mean that you're capped at $425,000 in exemption value, right? You can't get that. You're getting a percentage of the 425. It's an exemption against the first 425. And here's the tables, and we actually have 2 tables because there's different house site cap. So if you fall into this $0 to $10,000 income, you get a 99% house site exemption against that first 425K. And then at the top end of this first table, if you make 45,000 to 50, you get an 80% homestead exemption against the first 425K.
So this is new in the Senate?
This is new. This configuration
This
is
configuration, I thought the House also.
new. They did include a similar concept. It didn't use the same income brackets and house site values. This includes many more brackets. It's smoother. It's much smoother, you could say. It involves like 20. The graph looks funny. Not an insulting way. It's funny. Enjoy it later. Okay. You have a second table. Above we talked about the 425,000. We have a different table. Once you get to 50K, that exemption is available against the first 400,000 in house site value. And the reason for this, if you look at some of the slides that Julia has, you'll see how this produces a I'll leave it to others to. Anyway, you can see a table here, going all the way up to 100K. Your 50K to 55 gets 75%. And then from here, 95 to 100K gets a 5% homestead exemption, gets that first 400K in-house FIO, sorry. I'm going to try to jump really quickly through the rest if I can, but please stop me if you are troubled. We include the same measures related to allocating for co-op, right? We have to allocate the benefits to folks who are indirectly paying exemptions and credits, right? So we do that same kind of allocation and the like for this proposed homestead exemption.
We still have to do the homestead exemption or homestead declaration every year, but there's going to be a new, it's just going to be updated.
Yes, exactly. So there's a proposed report from Department of Tax to come up with a new form to reflect the informational needs required for this homestead exemption. This is all conforming changes for what we just talked about. What you're seeing a lot of this here is we now need to call out the PTC as exclusively municipal, right? Because it's now a municipal construct. We don't have that statewide PTC. And we need to also pick up the word exemption to distinguish between, before this contemplated just a credit, both statewide and municipal. So now we need to call out its exemption statewide and credit municipally. There is a meaningful part of this. I want to say this. Oh, no, it's not there. I'm sorry. When I see this, I will call it out. Here we go. Apply the same penalties to this exemption piece. Okay, section 43. This is what we were just discussing. By the end of this year, December 15th to 25, tax to provide to committees of jurisdiction for updating that homestead declaration to address the implementation of this exemption. And then additionally, the configuration that was included of that proposed homestead exemption was agreed to in committee, but they also thought that perhaps some further thought could go into this. So there's a proposal that on or before January 15th or 26th, the Department of Taxes in consultation with JFO was to submit a proposal on designing an alternative homestead exemption structure that minimizes the property tax impacts for homestead property owners under the new education tax structure. It minimizes the benefit cliffs compared to those in the existing credit system. And I would call out that the current configuration you see here, because it has what I described as a funny curve, does minimize benefit cliffs. There are not a lot of cliffs there, except at the very end, right, when you move from 100K to not. And at some point, you're going to have there will be nothing available. Also, to minimize aggregate fiscal impact relative to the existing credit system. The remainder of my sections are just conforming changes for that PTC, and then Kirby is next. Happy to answer questions, but also happy to let someone else sit in this chair.
Okay. Kirby, do you want to come up and give us a quick view of these last few sections?
Good afternoon, Kirby Keaton, Legislative Council. Congratulations, you've almost made it through this. Just a little bit left. So starting with section 48, give you some background real quick. Senate Education did not change the sections we're about to go through at all because they relate mostly to property valuation and what goes into the property tax system as opposed to the reform specifically. So Senate Finance made some changes, and so I'll kind of just tell you about what Senate Finance has done, and then also what Ways and Means had done before that, or the House, I should say, before that. We start off with a change to the definition of parcel within the statute for the grand list. What's in there now just goes to data collection and how data is collected, and this is what VCGI wants. It does not actually specifically relate to the bigger issues here. This section was originally in because the House did create a system for property classifications where there would be 4 different classes of property instead of just homestead and non-homestead. There was going to be 4 with possibly different rates, even though they didn't actually set different rates at this point for that. Senate Finance has removed that. So the only thing in this section that remains is this definition here, but you will not be seeing that language for the actual classification system. Instead, we have in section 49 a property tax classification study and an implementation proposal. This asks the Department of Taxes to come back this next December with an analysis and a study and suggestions for a way to set up a property tax classification system, specifically about residential properties and how they are used. The long-term idea has been to classify second homes and short-term rentals for possibly a higher tax rate, and to maybe identify long-term rentals to provide a smaller rate compared with other non-homestead properties, with the idea that tax burden relief might flow through to renters. So that's what this is about, and the study that the Department of Taxes will come back with. It's a very difficult thing to do, to set up this classification system in general. And there's been a lot of work going into trying to figure out how to do this, and tax is going to keep working on that. In section 50, there's the creation of regional assessment districts. This has to do with reappraising the grand list. Right now, recent changes in Vermont law made it so that municipalities are supposed to have a mass reappraisal of their entire grand list every 6 years. There was an Act 68 report that the Department of Taxes prepared with a consultant that looked into many issues with reappraisals, and this regional assessment districts stuff came out of the suggestions from that report. The gist of this is that by 2030, this language would have Vermont change over to, instead of having municipalities solely responsible for reappraising their entire town every 6 years, it would be, the way this is set up is basically on the county level, having regional assessment districts where those municipalities come together to, in most cases, probably hire third-party firms to come in and do multiple towns at once. The idea coming out of the 68 report is that this could save money possibly, and kind of create an economy of scale for doing these reappraisals. And you probably all know that many municipalities are behind, and for some municipalities it's been a very long time since they've reappraised, and some of the smaller ones have struggled to find a firm to do this for them. So this language all has to do with setting that up. There's a role by PBR, the Department of Taxes, to provide guidance to set this system up. But at this point, it's not putting PBR or the state in charge of this new system. There's a transition report, or an annual progress report here. This is just about winding down the current reappraisal system and setting up a new one. And then we also have a section where the Department of Taxes will have a stakeholder working group on this, where several questions are asked about setting this up. So basically what we're putting in the law now takes effect 2030. It's the scaffolding. The expectation is there'll be further studying on this, and the department will come back and flesh that out more, especially around questions about the role of the state in kind of managing the system, or whether it will be regionalized, how appeals might change. And at the same time, the plan is to switch to a January 1 grand list date instead of having it the April 1 date that we currently have. The main reason for doing that, there's a few reasons, but the main one is to allow more time for the appeals process to play out before tax billing happens in the summer. That's it. Regional assessment districts, classifications, those are the two big things that we're trying to be done here. The rest of this, there are 4 sections on some miscellaneous tax changes that relate to property valuation and related issues. This one's technical. This one is, there was a study last year on tax sales. You may or may not remember. There was a working group that came back and recommended that a minimum debt of $1,500 before a town can initiate a tax sale. So that was included in here. These are truly miscellaneous items. The last 2 things that we're going to look at came from the Department of Taxes. They'd like to, there's PDR hearing officers that hear property valuation appeals. Those people currently are paid $150 a day per diem. In order to actually attract good qualified people for that, the Department of Taxes would like to pay them $38 an hour instead. And last of all, technical change, because to get rid of a $15 fee for late property tax credit claims. That change was actually made last year, but there was one reference to it that existing law, and we're getting rid of it.
Okay. Thanks, Julie. I have a question which goes back in Betsy James' section, but it's important that I just understand when the maps are going to be created in this bill. So my understanding is we have this, what are we calling it? The district boundary task force. And am I correct that they have to have the map, that their recommendation by December 15th, 2025? Is that, I don't know if you're there, Ms. St. James. You know, John?
I can pull it up. What I recall is that they come with proposals and it's either end of this year or start of next year, and there's a contingency, right, if that can't be resolved.
Right, but it seems like it's a very quick turnaround, like in December 15th.
Just a second.
Then by January 30th, they have to have done the maps. They only have like a month. The legislature has like a month to say this is going to be the map.
Do you have the, sorry, I'm not sure.
So page.
I'm here, I'm sorry.
So I think if you look at the task force requirement is to, where's that? It's on.
Starting with section 3.
Yeah, section 3 on page 15 where it starts. So they need to submit this to the legislature. I remember it getting clear like in December. So on page 19, on before December 15th, 2025, F. But the alternative that they have to do is if the legislature doesn't do it by the 31st. So the legislators would get it December 15th, and by the 31st, they have to agree to it. Is that correct? That's
Yes.
the timeline?
Yes.
So you get that 6 weeks of 2 or 3 of which we're not in session to take in this map and decide whether you want it or not. And if you say yes, you use it. If you say no, there's going to be this alternative proposal.
Yes, that is accurate.
Seems weird, but what do I know? Okay. So that is the language. Any questions about the language? And attorneys? We get to the good part, we talk about the month.
I guess I do have a question.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the weights, which I think is you, Mr. Gray. So I had heard that the weights that came from the House were based on studies that had been done, and that the weights that are in this bill are perhaps more of a like the result of perhaps more negotiation.
Yeah, it's maybe dangerous for me to answer this. It is correct that the numbers that were chosen in the House were based on Dr. Colby's memo. The numbers that were selected in Senate Education were they were drawn from the enhanced EV model that the APA consultants put out, but they were tweaked in ways, right? And including one of the ways was to set a cap on the amount that could be spent, so you would have to recalculate the base amount to create weights that would result in that cap. So it used the Senate Education proposal, and we have Ezra here as well, who may be able to offer more on this front than I can, not to force them.
Do you want to weigh in?
Sure, Ezra Holden, Joint Fiscal Office. So yeah, like John was speaking to, you see many of these weights are the same numbers given in that AOE and APA memo that was released on, I believe, May 1st. But since the base number is different, the amount of dollars that would be raised is different. So yeah, you'll see those, and that was a modeling request. In order, those were added in And on a request in Senate Education, it was maintained through Senate Finance.
Does that answer your question?
Well, it does, thank you. And I think the further question that I have is not an answerable question, which is, what risk does that bring us to in terms of running afoul of Brigham? But I'm sure that can only be speculated upon.
Do you want an answer?
If you have one.
Attorneys like to speculate.
So it is important to note that it's speculation. The actual determination would be empirical, right? What the outcomes are. Are you funding a system that provides for substantial equality of educational opportunity, which is the question that we're asking under Brigham, right? You could choose arbitrary numbers that resulted in that outcome. You could choose really well empirically sourced numbers that don't result in that outcome, right? It's dependent on what happens in reality. But the question that you're going to face if someone brings a suit against this for common benefits clause violation, that this violates the holding in Brigham, is people are going to ask, like, why did you choose the particular foundation formula you have? And it is a easier to defend position if you chose numbers that are backed by empirics, right? You have something to say that educational experts said, these are the numbers that we think adequately finance child's education. And it's just, you're in a position, if you choose something different than that, when you have that option on the table, they're going to ask the question, well, why didn't you choose that, right? And why did you choose this other figure? It's not something you couldn't overcome. It's just a risk that you face. And of course, you guys are entitled as well to factor that risk into the decision that you make and not make the decision that minimizes risk, but make a different decision based on considerations you have. But yes, it's, an expert witness would be able to say you have on hand an empirically founded foundation formula, and you have another one that's not bad, and you chose the one that's not bad. So it's just, I would say that's increased risk of a suit being brought.
Thank you.
Don't know the outcome.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on the language? No. Mr. Keaton, we'll ask you to vacate chair for. Oh, we do. Oh, all good colored copies except Senator West.
Nice.
Cool.
Oh, dear.
Glad to see he's finally getting his just desserts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Give Bob your.
Yeah. We haven't heard
He didn't need a color copy.
Senator Norris yet.
Nope, yeah,
All right. You can introduce yourself for the record and take us through the fiscal note.
Yep. Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. There is a fiscal note posted on the committee page under my name. It's also been authored in part by Ezra and Chris. So go ahead and share my screen. Would you like me to walk through the fiscal note just all the way through or focus on any?
Well, I think since we did that walkthrough of all the language where you're kind of summarizing the bill, we don't need to do that. But I think definitely the sections that have appropriations or any kind of fiscal impact.
Yep.
And any other, if you think it's important to highlight.
Sure.
Other reasons.
So there are a few appropriations in the bill as it was recommended out of Senate Finance. I know that Emily and Amy have been working to pick those up into a potential appropriations amendment. As you just heard, the bill would make significant changes and numerous changes to the ed finance system and education funding system. So all in all, because a lot of this is dependent on future policy decisions, the overall fiscal impact of the bill is unclear because it will depend on a lot of future policy decisions like district configurations. That being said, there are some direct fiscal impacts in the bill that we can estimate. this table here on page 2 of the fiscal note has the fiscal impacts of H454 for fiscal year 2026 as it has been recommended out of Senate Finance. So the school district boundary task force, this is that 8-member legislative task force responsible for drawing the maps. There's 8 members, so there would be per diems of that. The bill also appropriates $100,000 to the Office of Legislative Counsel for 1 or more consultants, right? There's no GIS expert in legislative staff, for instance. That was one example of a consultant that may be needed. Sections 15 and 16, the bill requires some review of state board rules. And so there's an appropriation to facilitate the review of those rules. So $200,000 is appropriated in one-time general
Or do you
fund.
think they would like this to hire an attorney to have to work through, or just some other consultant?
That's a good question. It's to the Agency of Education to provide the agency with resources to review and update the board's rules. I don't know what those resources would entail.
It's almost always when they ask for money, it's an attorney, so.
Yeah, I know when they came in there for their budget proposal, they were like, we need an attorney to help us go through this. So I wonder if this was similar. Yes.
We put positions all in the budget as we did it. These all match the positions in the
That was
budget.
my
Yeah.
question, yeah.
We actually took the positions out of the budget because we weren't sure how this was gonna end up. We thought finance was still working on it, so we wanted to make sure they did line up, so we took all that stuff out of the budget. We played with the idea of finance putting it in there. They were busy just trying to get it out, so they said we will do it when it gets here. So we have a draft amendment that will do that.
And so this fiscal note does not incorporate a lot of what's in that draft amendment, right? These are just the pieces that were included in as passed out of Senate Ed and Senate Finance. And a lot of these pieces are consistent from the House's position. For instance, the House had some per diems different. They had a different task force. They had some per diems for school districts. They had the appropriation for the state board rules, so on.
Because if the committee remembers, when Secretary Saunders came in after the governor's recommended budget, that they needed $4 million for the transition, we put it in the BAA. There was some language that the House had about needing a plan before they could spend it during fiscal. So we took all that out. So the draft amendment has language on how to spend the $4 million, and then also kind of justifies, lines up the appropriations in the bill with that $4 million ask. And that's a line to spell it all out.
Because they wanted access to it right away, not $1 million a year, right?
Right. And also there was some appropriations, so that actually, it's a little less than 4 million that AOE gets because we had to account for some of the appropriations in the bill.
So the other costs in the bill, before getting into the amendment, Section 5 and 9, this is the state aid school construction program. Beth briefly walked through this. Part of that is that there would be a few positions started in AOE to staff the school construction aid program. They would be hired prior to the program's start, but those positions have not been outlined in the bill, so the bill requires AOE to come back with a description of those positions. So it's fair to, so we've estimated $450,000 absent the direct position description of those staff. There's some school construction advisory board in section 6 that would require per diems for the board members, $3,000 cost to AOE. There's a new permanent position at AOE to support the strategic plan development for special education. This would be an ongoing cost, and there's a base general fund appropriation to AOE of $150,000. And then lastly, this miscellaneous tax piece, the compensation adjustment for the part-time hearing officers, which is estimated to be $20,000 and would be a base cost to the department that they've included in their budget. So that's a quick high level of the FY26 costs, estimated costs. Is there anything else that you'd like me to walk through? in the fiscal note. The remainder of the fiscal note has sort of been separated into two sections. The first half of the fiscal note is really the policy sections of the bill. And then starting on page 8, thank you, page 8 of the fiscal note, this is where the significant financing and funding changes start in the bill. So this is sort of, I've been referencing it as a fiscal note within a fiscal note. This is spelling out all of those financing changes.
I think your table, it's much easier to see the weights on your table on the fiscal note than it is to see the weights in the bill.
Sure.
Yes.
So the base amount would be 14,541. To answer one of the earlier questions, that number was determined by essentially taking all of the weights in the bill, applying them against student counts, and then calculating a base that would raise the same amount of 1.88 billion, which was the FY25 education payment. So essentially, what base would get us to spending the same amount on education? And the answer was 15,541. This is different than the Senate Ed proposal because the, sorry, I just saw Ezra look at me, I misspoke, 14,541. This is different than the Senate Ed proposal because the Senate Ed proposal did not have a CTE weight. So the Senate Finance Committee added in a contingent CTE weight that John spoke about. This table here is capturing all of those weighting categories. These are additive weights. So essentially the way to think about it is a student counts as one. And then any category that they fit into here, within the colors, they're mutually exclusive, right? So you're not going to be an English learner of multiple levels of proficiency. You're going to be level 1, level 2, etc.
Except you could also be a slave.
Except for newcomer slave, that is on top of the level proficiency weights. But essentially what this is saying is, you're a student, you count as 1. If you're in grades 9 through 12, you count as 1.1 because you're adding this 0.1 weight. You're an English learner, then we add the English learner weight on top of that. If you're from an economically disadvantaged background, we're going to add in 1.02 on top of that. So if a student were to fit into multiple of these categories, which happens and is quite common, then that student would carry 1 plus all of the weights that would apply to them. And that would be the amount of funding associated with that pupil.
And the maximum was 4.9, is that what we figured out? Like
yeah, we did some brief math this morning that if you were to fit into all of the weighting categories at the highest amount, you would be coming in at 4.95 or 4.96.
72,000.
I was thinking about that. The one case there is that I think it's unlikely that you're going to be in a small school, part of a small school enrollment, and also full-time CTE pupil. So it's gonna.
You can't do both of them. Yeah.
But somewhere in the ballpark of 4 plus would be the maximum number of weighted pupils that a single child could count.
The difference between the House bill and this. They did all the weightings too?
Yes, for the most part.
For the most part, what difference is there between the proposal that we're looking at and the House in the weightings?
So the House proposal adopted all of the numbers in Dr. Colby and Baker's memo. There were no grade, so essentially what that was commissioned research. They presented a memo in April that reran the cost analysis with updated data consistent with the cost analysis that was performed that led up to Act 127. And in that updated analysis, they identified what they determined to be the groups that needed increased weights. And those were the weights and the base that was put into the House proposal. So the House proposal did not include any grade level weights consistent with the memo. It did include the tiered English learner weights, included students from economically disadvantaged background weight. And then it did not include a CTE weight. And then what the House did is instead of applying weights for small schools, they had a small school and/or sparse district support grant. So the educational opportunity payment would be calculated based off of the individual student circumstances times the base. And then there would also be a small school and support grant that was consistent with Dr. Colby and Baker's memo. It used all of the same underlying numbers, but it was a separate type of payment to the school district.
Yeah, I'm only asking this because we sent so much, and I'm trying to keep this in my head because there's a lot. The weights versus the 14,500 that is the base. The Senate proposal, it's the 14,500, whatever it is, times whatever number of students in the school to get the excess spending number.
The base times the number of students in the school.
Right.
Correct, no weights.
No weights.
Yeah.
The Senate, the House proposal included the weights, which would make it much more generous.
Which would allow, yes, in the sense that it would allow districts to vote to raise more. That 10% would be a higher amount.
And I only mentioned that.
Like in the House, if we had one of those that was 70,000, it would be up to
Right.
$7,000 instead of
Yeah,
15.
I get it. So I'm just trying to, it's much more so the Stows and the South Burlingtons of this world, that would give them more ability.
Except we don't know if Stowe's in a bigger district with a bunch of smaller
Well,
towns. that might not.
if we accomplish the bigger
Right.
districts.
Right, which is why I think a lot of people want to know what the districts are before they. decide whether they like
I'm in that same boat, you know, every map I've seen has Lamoille County, the districts that ran sometimes is Randolph, which.
Right. I thought your other table also was helpful. I don't know if you want to jump to that or anything else, but table 3, because when you read those statute, it's hard to see the value caps.
Sure. So this is going to the homestead exemption. That's the income sensitivity portion of the bill. So what this is saying here is you've got your household income. Household income refers to the total income of people living within a dwelling. And then within that household income, the exemption percentage that would be applied for the purpose of the homestead exemption. And then the final column is the cap on the house site that the exemption can be applied against. I did put this into a visual for Senate Finance. This is essentially what that would look like for the more visual folks. So this, if you can see colors green, but really this step down line here is referencing the exemption percent. So what we see on the x-axis is household income. On the left-hand Y is the house site exemption percentage, and that's corresponding with our green step down chart. So you can see that as a household income increases, the house site exemption percentage decreases. And then this blue line here at the top is the maximum exemption against which the house site exemption could be applied to. And that blue line corresponds with the right-hand y-axis.
So is this chart and the other chart that you had?
Do you want me to show that next?
Yes, please.
Sure. So this.
But those two charts, they're we would find those on the stuff presented.
I can send them to Elle after this.
That would
Yeah, send your slide deck. But
Yeah.
this one,
This slide deck has a ton of modeling that ended up not landing on, so I'll pull out these specific slides and send them to Elle.
Okay.
What we're looking at here is a table that's representing the average.
is this the graph that John said looked fun?
This is the graph that John was saying looks funny.
Oh, really? I thought the other one was funny.
Awesome, funny.
Because it has that white cloud there, and like,
Oh.
I guess I just don't know John's sense of humor.
So what this is looking at here is a way that we've been looking throughout the course of the session at examining the estimated impacts of the different homestead exemptions.
So Can I just interrupt? Because that's, earlier when I looked at this slide, I was confused by the 0 to 5, because it's really 0 to 10. So if you're.
Yeah, so what
you're
this,
Still impacted.
so what this is looking at here is the household income on our left-hand side, and that equalized house site value, so 100% fair market value, that's what it means. On the top, the reason that I've separated these into the groupings that they're separated into is just so that we have uniform groups. So the way to read this is if the household income was between 0 and 5,000 and you lived in a house site that at fair market value was appraised to be 0 to 50,000, you would see an average increase of $38.
Why is it different between 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 if the bill just goes 0 to 10?
Because if you think about the way that this is structured is this is talking about taking off a percentage of your house site value. So depending on how much your house site is valued at, the percent applied against it is going to be a less or greater.
And you're comparing it to the
discount.
current income sensitivity. So it's different, that's why it's different by every 5,000.
Exactly. So this table is compared, this table is looking at compared to fiscal year 25 average property tax bill, how much would your average group in each one of these cells either increase or decrease with the new proposal? If it's blue, then it would be an estimated decrease on average by the amount that's captured in that cell. And white is showing where there would be an estimated increase for the households in that group.
And why is there an increase for that $0 to $5,000 group? It seems like
because of so this gets to one of the things that your colleagues across the hall have been grappling with is this is comparing to our current law income sensitivity system. So under current law, we have these cliffs at certain points, right? You have the circuit breaker. So if your household income is between a certain amount, then you only pay a certain percentage of your household income in property taxes under current law. So we're not comparing to a completely neutral state. We're comparing to current law where there are these significant parameters in current law, also at 90,000, which is why we see changes at 90,000. And at 47,000. So Senate Finance asked me to come up with a structure that costs the same as income sensitivity under current law. So this cost is estimated to cost 1.6 million less than income sensitivity under current law, which in the ed fund is pretty close to 0. Yeah. And they asked me to target the average decrease towards the lower income households and the households with lower house site values. So that's why they call this the blue wave. Why they were referring to this as the blue wave, because that was the structure that they decided to move forward with.
I'm still, is it just because I'm under the income sensitivity, if you're under 5,000, you don't?
You pay a certain percentage of your income. So if you think about if your income is
so low that you're
very low, then you may be paying nothing.
Right, because you're just getting, especially if you're at that higher home site value.
Yeah, and the other piece that I would note when looking at this chart is keeping in mind the estimated average impact that you're looking at. This is an estimated average increase of $38. This is an estimated average increase of $1. Whereas in other places in the map, you're looking at estimated increases of over $2,000. So the white cells, while they're both white, they're very different.
And some are white and 0.
Yeah, that's rounding, so maybe some cents on average. Okay. So this is the that is the structure of the homestead exemption that John walked through. It's included in the bill. The House did also include a homestead exemption, but it had a different structure than this. It also was estimated to cost more than income sensitivity under current law, and because it was estimated to cost more, then there was more blue. right? More decreases because the income sensitivity was being made more generous. But the House did not contemplate where that increased cost would be raised from. So all else equal, that would fall on all property taxpayers to pay for the increase in income sensitivity.
And was the graph just as funny and when the, on the House proposal?
This was the
That's
House
less
graph.
funny.
I don't think either are funny, so I don't
Oh, no,
know.
this one is worse than the other one.
Yeah, this one's got bigger cliffs.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
got bigger clips.
Center one.
Is there an equivalent to that blue wave graph that we saw for the House version?
That is, so it's all the same parameters, all of the same. There's a lot of underlying assumptions
a
that I
blue
haven't
flood.
told you with, but I'm just gonna say lots of caveats.
Can I just ask?
Where are you done?
Well, I guess going back to the other one, the one for the Senate version, the blue wave graph, just a comment that at the bottom of this graph makes my brain melt a little bit. You know, the fact that somebody might be making, 105, 110,000 is going to see a greater increase than somebody making more money.
Right.
And I realize that is a function of our tax.
For currency.
Yeah, and that's just
Yeah.
makes me
not how you
mad.
would
It's not
design
how I would do it.
Especially from scratch.
Right.
But as a comparison of
I know.
this.
Right.
cushy
Yeah.
system we
Yeah.
have.
Like that's. I realize that there may be some other issues to solve there to resolve that, but that. Makes
But
me
it's
mad.
also an opportunity for conversation between two conference committees.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, something else to keep in mind on this, and not trying to push for one way or the other, but something else to keep in mind is, again, to your point, this is comparing against current law,
Mhm.
where you see an income threshold at 90,000. That's where the income sensitivity drops from being able to apply to 400,000 of property value to 225,000 of property value. So naturally, because that cliff exists in the current system, you're going to see that
Oh, yeah.
significant change. So another way to look at this is to look at this, what would the overall tax bill be? And also in this slide deck, I have included the average net education property tax under current law. So in theory, you could, if you were interested in a specific group, you could look at, well, this is what they're estimated on average to pay under current law, plus or minus whatever is on this blue wave graph.
Got you. Yeah, well, that helps. Actually. Thank you.
Because somebody will ask, and I think I have, but why did they settle at 425?
They,
And what is 425 based on?
sure. So they asked for me to come back with they were looking at a lot of different modeling scenarios, and they asked for me to come back with a couple of different scenarios that minimized or that targeted the decreases to these groups. That is one mathematical way of targeting it to the lower income groups. They were coalescing more or less around 400,000 because one of the members of the committee had looked up what the median house site value was in the state, and they felt like that was more representative, I think.
The only reason I asked that, and I think the more I think about it this morning, if you're in high property value community, higher property value community, it that number becomes more important, and you become disadvantaged. You know, I can find communities maybe in the Northeast Kingdom where there's hardly a home above 425,000. In a community like mine, or in, when you move into Chittenden County, 425,000 is not a very big home.
And that is certainly something that folks have been talking about and grappling with in other committees. One of the things to keep in mind, and this is a policy decision, is that because we have a statewide education fund, a statewide education property tax. What that means is the cost of income sensitivity is borne by all property taxpayers. So to the extent that you were to increase the amount of income sensitivity or the homestead exemption in one area of the state, that would increase the cost
No,
and be borne by the rest of the
I
state.
totally understand that, but administratively, it brings up the question, would you, not, and how much different would it be, or more difficult to administer if we broke the state out in certain regions? You know, certainly Chittenden County is going to be different than Caledonia County.
It's not gonna be based on income, it's gonna be based on income in the real estate market you live in.
Right, you know.
Okay, any other highlights or questions people have?
One other question,
Yeah.
and this is a part of my ignorance for how the current system works, but in a scenario like this, how do we deal with renters?
So renters, there is a renter rebate that's paid out of the general fund.
And so that stands.
So that's not changed at all. Under current law,
It's a shitty program. We haven't increased it enough.
That's an official
Maybe-
appropriations term.
not gonna comment
It
on
used to
that.
be, it used to be a good program, but we haven't increased it in years.
Okay.
At 55,000 for
Doesn't provide a lot.
household income, when it begins to all peter out,
Okay.
that's pretty pitiful.
Mhm.
Very low.
Sorry.
No, I agree with you.
The other,
I couldn't help myself.
the other tangential rental related piece gets back to the property classifications. So, the Senate version maintains a non-homestead property class and a homestead property class where the definitions are consistent with current law. So non-homestead would still capture your rental properties as well as second homes, businesses, deer camp, etc. It does include a report for that, for tax to come back with, how different taxation could be studied. The House proposal did separate it into four.
Okay, thank you.
That would help. Okay, anything else you want to tell us about your wonderful system?
Send us those other charts and we wanna
I will
Do you have
send
like
this,
44 slides, is that what it is?
root through it over again.
45 slides. I will send them along, maybe with a little bit more, better labeling, because they didn't include all of them, but yes. No, I think that you've covered it all, unless there's something else you'd like me to talk about.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So as I said earlier, we'll have Ms. Byrne come up and talk about our amendment, or proposed amendment from the committee that would add in this $4 million. Do you want to go over the chart first before I hand out some of the wording?
I think that might make it easier, yeah. I should probably.
Oh, I have the whole bill here, I forget.
If I printed them for people, as, you know, because you guys like that.
Yeah, here's the bill.
That might be helpful as we go through this.
I forgot, that's what I was going to, Pat. Yeah. Okay, that's all, see how it goes. Okay,
All right.
for the record.
For the record, Emily Burke, Joint Fiscal Office. I have a quick spreadsheet. Shocking, I came in here with a spreadsheet, I know. That way, this is just a quick overview of the appropriations in the education transformation bill and the changes contemplated in the amendment you have before you. So you'll recall you received a memo from the Secretary of Education back on May 6th, with a budget request on how to spend the $4 million that was allocated in the governor's recommended budget, and that was contemplated in the House and Senate. You'll recall the conference committee and the budget that you just signed off on sort of had money on the bottom line or set aside $4 million for this bill. So in the column that sort of says requests fiscal note, this is sort of capturing, we have requests from the Agency of Education, and then the appropriations that are mentioned in the fiscal note in the table that Julia just walked you through. So in H454, as passed by the Senate, there was in section 3I is where you have the $100,000 for the school district boundary task force consultant. The fiscal note also included a cost of $33,000 for the per diems associated with the committee. There's additional appropriations made to the Agency of Education. In section 16B, there's $200,000 appropriated to the State Board of Education for rule review. The School Construction Task Force and Advisory Board, these are sort of talked about in the bill and have the requirement that the agency come back with position information, but those appropriations are not made in the bill as it currently stands.
Or the dollar numbers, they just say the advisory board shall get per diems, and they talk about the task force. They don't mention $450,000 in the bill.
Correct, that's JFO's estimate based on hiring 3 positions to support the task force.
So it says 3 positions, but they don't.
They're not funded and they're not talked about. So that's, if that was to move forward in the future, would cost $450,000.
Okay.
And then in section 20, subpart A and subpart B is the establishment of a position and an appropriation of $150,000 for the special education strategic planning process. So those, if we take the $4 million is requested by the administration, plus the sort of costs that are contemplated in the fiscal note, the $4.9 million anticipated cost of this bill. And so we've sort of tried to, but only $4 million is set aside as part of the budget construct. So in the column that's labeled H454, these 3 appropriations are the ones that are currently in the bill as passed by Senate Finance. The $100,000 for the school district task force, the State Board of Education rule review, and the special education strategic plan. If you look at the bill that's in front of you, you'll see those appropriations made in those sections. And then, so that's $450,000. The bill does not appropriate the money for education transformation. That was part of the conference committee's discussion that those funds would be appropriated in this bill. So to appropriate the remaining of those, the amendment that will be handed out has 3 appropriations to the Agency of Education. The first is to support 5 positions at the Agency of Education from the pool for $562,500. The agency had requested that all 5 positions be fully funded as of July 1st. Given the fact that it's the end of May or middle of May, but by the time this bill passes, the RFRs are established, the hiring process goes forward. In FY 2026, we anticipate they're only going to need about 9 months worth of appropriations worth of funding for those 5 positions. So we've reduced that request accordingly. There's a request for $200,000 to support transitions of school boards. That's in the amendment. And then there was a request for consultants of the Agency of Education. Given that there are appropriations made in the bill and there's only a budget available of $4 million, we've reduced the amount of funding that's available for consultants of the Agency of Education to $2.7 million in FY 26. And then finally in the amendment, there is change to section 3I, which is the school district boundary task force, which appropriates the $33,000 that's necessary to support the task force. In having conversations with Catherine and Scott about the legislative budget, the General Assembly's budget doesn't have the capacity to fund a $33,000 16 meeting 8-member task group. So this appropriates the money to ensure that there's funding to support that group as contemplated in the bill as passed by Senate Finance. all in all, the amendment before you adds $3.5 million worth of appropriations to the bill. Additionally, the amendment includes the establishment of the 5 positions as requested by the Agency of Education.
5 plus the special education, so the 6?
There are 6 positions in the bill. The 6th position, the special education one, is in section 20, is established there.
Senator Bruce, that table there, that describes, I think, a little easier to understand than the language in the proposed draft amendment.
For those people, to be clear, the $4 million in the constructed budget, we kept on the bottom.
Yeah, we kept that for specifically for this purpose. So we're not appropriating any additional money we weren't expecting to. We're just moving it around a little bit. And there are other, I think, technical changes. I don't know if Ms. St. James wants to say anything about this amendment that she drafted.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will just note that the last 3 instances of amendment are just to the effective date section and moving punctuation around to add the 2 new sections that you're adding for the transformation, appropriations, and position. But the substantive amendments, Emily just walked you through.
Okay. And the 5 positions are listed here, which we got from AOE and what they wanted, what position titles they were looking for. So are people okay with this amendment?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we want to, well, I guess we'll just, by show of hands, is everybody supportive of adding this amendment to the bill, whether you're going to vote for the bill? You don't like the amendment? Okay. So we're going to say the amendment.
I figured you were going to say, is there anybody opposed to it?
Yeah.
I'm kind of
Okay. So I'm going to say the amendment is from the unanimous from the committee. If there's no other questions about the bill.
Well, we can't say it's unanimous because.
Unanimous for those present.
Yeah.
So if that's for the bill, we could entertain a motion to move the bill out of committee.
So moved.
You want to move it?
Favor.
Okay. So any discussion before we have the clerk call the roll?
Sure. Well, I would just say that I am supportive of the amendment to add clarity. I have a lot of concerns about this bill, and so I'm planning to vote no. I'm happy to explain more, but that's where I'm at right now.
Okay.
I'm going to vote no on here. I don't know what I'm going to do on the floor. It is very concerning to me that particularly a community that wanted to spend below the average can't give it back to taxpayers. And if there are a number of other areas, and I expect there will be amendments on the floor, and they might affect how I think.
Okay. Any other comments? Yes?
Yeah, I'm going to vote yes, and I'm going to vote with the hopes of an amendment that will be forthcoming to take care of the very problems Senator Westman talked about and some of the problems I have in reverse. I think we'll probably present that on the floor, I'm guessing. I'm not sure, but so I'm voting yes just to move the bill along in hopes that we can further tweak it with another amendment.
Okay.
I better say something.
Sounds
But
like
everybody else
it.
is, right? I think that there's a lot of work embedded in the bill, both in the House and the Senate, and both the Education Committee and the Finance Committee. It's a work in progress. I don't see it as finished progress at all. And I look forward to having that work continue. So I will vote for the bill. And there are things I like in it and things that will probably be changed and improve the bill. So I think it's important to keep it going.
Okay. With that, the clerk shall call the roll.
Okay, Senator Norris, Senator Watson,
No.
Senator Baruth,
Yes.
Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator Westman,
No.
Senator Brennan, yes, Senator Perchlet.
Yes, with explanation.
Oh, my.
He's not here.
Norris, we never,
Right,
and my explanation is similar to Senator Brennan's. I'm not sure how I'm gonna vote on the floor, but I wanna move it along. I'm specifically concerned about not knowing what the districts are. Like, that seems to be a big deal, and it's like, I'm hoping that we can get to that position to where we would have a chance to make changes based on, or change our support of it based on what the districts are, because I think that's gonna be critical on the numbers and how it affects the communities.
Mhm.
I'm also have some other concerns, but still studying the bill.
A lot in the same way, but I landed on the no side, because when I look at this, if we can't accomplish the districts, and I end up with smaller districts, when we move into this, I've got communities that if they could take advantage of spending, giving back to taxpayers something, if they spent a little less, it would make me feel more comfortable. But, you know, it all depends on what the amendments are on the floor.
And not only my concern not knowing what the districts are, but the way the bill is now is it's 8 legislators that kind of decide, and not kind of, they will decide on the map. And the legislature only has like 2 weeks to decide. So it seems like we're giving a lot of power on the maps, the boundaries, which is a critical part of it, to those 8 legislators. And without knowing who the 8 are, I'm a little worried about giving them that extra authority.
And then the House has a whole other construct for that.
Correct.
So we don't know what will come out of the conference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there'll be another vote after conference. So any other,
how about a reporter?
yes, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah.
They didn't want us.
Yeah, that's how you got out of recording.
That's what we get.
Okay, with that, we can adjourn.
No. Can I bring up H91,
Oh,
which came to us today,
um,
which is the homeless bill?
yeah,
It does have that appropriation that we put in. We moved it from the budget to the bill and allowed for the Senate Health and Welfare to consider the appropriations within the bill.
my only worry is I know that Senator Watson has to leave.
Oh, dear.
I've got a little time. How long do you think it will take?
It won't take me more than 5 minutes, but it is a bill that you haven't looked at.
Right. Do we need to do it today, or like, do you need to move it along, or?
Well, I'd like to get it moving along. If we wait until Tuesday, then it doesn't go up to the floor until, because it'll be after our 10 o'clock floor time. It won't go up until Wednesday morning.
And we don't have a fiscal, there will be a fiscal note on it, or we don't know?
Nolan has.
Yes, but Nolan was in a meeting, I'm sure he still is. Katie McLean has to leave hard stop 3:45 in about 15 minutes from now. We'll see if I can get them both down here as soon as possible. But
Is the fiscal note completed, or we don't know?
no, he said that he's writing a new one, so he won't have it.
It will be a new one. So I'll leave it to you because it's how you want to do that.
I think since we haven't seen it, and it's a big deal, I'd rather wait and see the fiscal note and everything.
And
like that.
we can try to expedite it in other ways,
That would be good.
once we
Okay.
get it out.
Okay.
And I'll look at it. I won't be here on Tuesday, but I think you'll have the trusted vice chair to move it through the committee. But I'll just make sure I haven't seen the final bill. So.
Yeah. No, it's the end. It's just how we distributed the $10 million that we have.